This is video 4.3 for the Research Methods course, RS-503. We're going to shift now to our other reference textbook, Vhymeister and Robertson. We're going to cover chapters 17 and 18 in this video. So as in the last video, a lot of nuts and bolts mechanics about research writing, and so we're going to kind of get the point of view of these authors here for research writing. So chapter 17, the section Research English. English research writing uses simple, concise, and clear language. And I might add at this point, I'm having you read a book called Strunk and White, and that's we will go over that pretty soon. And Strunk and White is sort of I think it came out first in like the 1920s, but it's always been, you know, the little concise guide book for writing, and they drive home the same point about simple, concise, and clear language. It's some other words used here. It's impersonal, it's objective, it's formal, dignified, factual, unbiased. So we are, again, we're not expressing opinions necessarily in these types of papers. We're trying to move beyond feelings, that sort of thing, and so we're trying to be very objective in our presentation of our information. And so that's why, you know, simplicity, clarity, conciseness is important. And I really like conciseness. I just don't like to read papers that are real flowery. It's sort of like the student enjoys, enjoys watching himself write or something. I like to the point papers, and I'll point that out to you. If you're not getting to the point, I'll tell you about it. Generally speaking, the first person singular does not appear in research writing, and I've kind of said that in the last video. The first person plural may, if you are presenting a point of view that is held by you and others, you can say, you know, we believe this, we support this kind of thing. But first person singular, no. Don't leave out I. So in the conclusion, don't say, I think this. You know, you need to rewrite that in more of a third person, objective sort of style. As often as possible, use the active voice. You know, it's good to have a variety, and you know, occasionally put in the passive, but really that active voice is much more lively and much more to the point. It keeps the paper moving, as it were. So active voice is really best. A paper or thesis is not the place to use fancy words. So yes, you know, keep it simple. There's no reason to use fancy words if they're not absolutely necessary. Now, sometimes if you're dealing with some theological issue and it's known by a fancy word, well then, yeah, you have to use it. But, you know, a kind of a pet peeve of mine is many times commentators, they throw in these Latin phrases and without explanation, you know, so I got to stop and, you know, Google the Latin phrase, just see what it means, you know. And so I'm like, why couldn't you just say that in English? Are you trying to impress me or something? So yeah, I just don't think there's a place for that sort of thing. Research language is modest and tentative. Instead of definite dogmatic words such as never, all, or none, use some, somewhat, or often. Even when you have evidence for what you write, do not overstate your case. And so this is important, I think. because when you start using never, always, something like that, then you're starting to get a little dogmatic. And the right answer may truly be never or always. But that kind of puts the reader on the defensive. You could say, the right answer may be something like, Paul never uses this term in this letter. But don't say it like that. Just say, Paul does not use this term in his letters. And that way you're not coming across as polemic or dogmatic, and your reader will likely as not won't get defensive about that. Research language is standard, not colloquial. It never uses slang. The contracted forms of the negative, can't, won't, or didn't are out of place. So don't do that. Don't use contracted forms. Say cannot or will not or did not. Don't use contractions. Now here's a little chart, and so the second column is an example of standard sort of language. So that's kind of the column that we want to follow. So to the left is really too formal. And to the right is a little too casual. We want to kind of be in that standard column. And she points out here that a great temptation of theology students is to use a sermonic language rather than research language. So you're not preaching in these papers. So try to avoid the language of the pulpit. So keep it, don't be too formal, don't be too casual. Now, one thing I've noticed in papers in the past is when they're writing about the book of Acts, and many students, when they refer to the author of the book of Acts, they refer to Dr. Luke. Don't do that. That is way too casual. That's something you might say in a sermon. Okay, just say Luke says this. That kind of thing. So the paragraph, the smallest unit of the paper. A paper is only as strong as its weakest paragraph. A paragraph should be about one topic. And I'm trying to drive that point home. Rule of thumb, if your paragraph fills more than one computer screen, it is suspect. A short paragraph is better than a long one. But you don't want a bunch of, 3-line paragraphs. Okay? But it's better to be short than long. A good paragraph puts in one place all the material that belongs together and keeps it apart from other items that do not belong. Every well-constructed paragraph has a unifying thought. So every paragraph has a main idea. And so every paragraph should have a topic sentence that states the main idea of the paragraph. It usually will come at the beginning. However, according to Vhymeister and Robertson, it could be in the middle, it could be at the end, but it's got to be somewhere in that paragraph. A strong paragraph hangs together. Paragraph coherence is concerned with order in which the information is presented and with the clear and logical relationship of one statement to the next in the development of ideas. A coherent paragraph conveys information clearly and effectively. So make your paragraph have one topic, one unifying thought. State what that unifying thought is, perhaps in the beginning sentence, and make all of the sentences about that same unifying thought. And then you'll have a coherent paragraph, a paragraph that is clear, a paragraph that is easy to read and understand. Vhymeister and Robertson presents here a list of transitional words. And so this is just a list of words that you could use to transition from, say, one sentence to the next, one paragraph to the next. So kind of take this as a reference chart, if you will. Use a variety of these transition words. And I would say really use a variety of words in general. Don't use the same word like 5 times in one paragraph. Don't repeat yourself like that. Use synonyms. You've got a thesaurus in Microsoft Word, or you can have a thesaurus in a book sitting beside you, but mix it up. You have a variety of words. So how about when you have quotations? So formal quotations may be preceded by a colon or a comma. And I've seen it both ways, and I think that either one is acceptable. So what I mean by that, like here's an example. Paul wrote the Corinthians, colon, and then there's a verse, pursue love. So I think colon is acceptable there. But if you want to say, the commentator Smith says, and then you could put comma, and then the quotation mark, that would be fine too. You can weave a quotation into your sentence. And then, so if your quotation in the source begins with a capital letter, you'll need to change that to a small letter if you're weaving it into a sentence. So what if you say something like this? Paul wrote to the Corinthians that they should pursue love. Well, that's not a quote, right? So no quotation marks, but it's saying the same thing. So you can reword quotations in something like that manner there. So that's kind of a paraphrase. Now, if you're quoting another author, you need to, put a footnote there and cite that. So how about if you're quoting biblical texts? Now, first, here's an example. 1 Samuel 3:10 says, and Vhymeister and Robertson, interestingly, do not like that approach. I think that's fine. 1 Samuel 3:10 says, and then you could put a comma, quotation mark, and quote the passage. They like, in 1 Samuel 3:10 we read. That would be fine too. I'm really fine with both of those. But notice the first thing there, the first example. 1 Samuel 3:10 says. Notice that first is not the numeral 1. It's spelled out. You never begin a sentence with a number. You want to make it a word. So that's why that's like that. You have to spell out the word first. The quotation of longer passages has its own rules. According to Turabian's verdict, when you quote 5 or more lines in which there are at least 2 separate sentences, you have a block quotation. So if your quotation is 5 lines or more, it has to be indented the same amount as a paragraph, which is a 1/2 inch, and it's single spaced. So if it's 4 lines or less, it's just within the paragraph. But if it's 5 lines or more, it has to be a block quote, which is indented and single spaced. Okay, the writing process, the first draft, write and rewrite. Just one thing here, and I agree with this 110%. Experience tells me that I see mistakes more easily on a printed page than on a computer screen. Amen to that. Rewriting includes deleting, adding, rearranging, checking spelling and punctuation, completing footnotes, and general editorial work. Now, since a large part of this course is footnoting and bibliography, you really need to look close at your footnotes and look close at your bibliography and make sure you have those correct. And there's a lot to look at there. I mean, there's little commas to consider, and some of it's in italics, some of it's not, some of it's in quotes, some of it's not. You know, there's periods to consider. I mean, there's a lot of detail to look at, especially in footnotes. So you have to really look at those footnotes hard, and also the bibliography. Make sure you have those correct. So when you're proofreading, don't forget about the footnotes and bibliography. The second draft, write and rewrite. Now is a good time to read the whole paper again, this time aloud or to someone else. I think that's a great idea, is read your paper aloud, either to yourself or to someone. When you are reading a paper aloud and you're listening to it, you can really get a handle on a couple of things. You can get a handle on flow. You can get a sense of how well it's organized. But you can also get a sense of bad syntax, bad grammar. You can read a sentence and you say, that's bad grammar. But sometimes you can only hear it out loud. And so reading it aloud will really help you polish up that paper. In the revision process, the writer needs to look for wrong spellings, bad punctuation, unclear sentences, and anything else that mars the reading. So what you're looking for is the flow of ideas. Make sure there's continuity in your paper. And again, continuity goes back to that outline. Second, coherence. There should be a cohesion of ideas and sentences. And so, again, make sure it's organized. And that goes back to that outline. Third, bridges. There should be natural bridges from one topic to another. And so you use those transition words that we saw earlier. There should be a logic of organization. Again, the outline is so important. And then weak spots or omissions. Try not to have places where the reader can tell the research is insufficient. And you may have to go back to the library and look for more things, but there may be things where there's holes in your argument. And so proofreading will help surface those. Awkward sentences. Again, if you read it aloud, you can hear that awkwardness and be able to change it up. And then don't have unnecessary words. Don't say this is pretty clear or this is very clear. Just say this is clear. That's all you got to say. You don't want to have too many unnecessary adjectives and adverbs. The best way to say something is the simplest and shortest way. So never forget that when you're writing. Okay, let's go to chapter 18, organizing the paper. And so we're just going to discuss briefly the parts of the paper. So there's 5 main parts: the preliminary pages, the introduction, the body, the summary and conclusions, and the bibliography. So the preliminary pages are 2 for us. It's the kind of the title page with the title of the paper on it and the name of the course and all that. And then the second page is the thesis and outline page. And then you get into the text of the paper. So the text of the paper should begin with a good introduction. The introduction sets the stage, prepares the reader to understand the purpose, nature, and direction of the research. So you need to kind of set the scope of the paper in the introduction. The main body of the text gives a clear report of the findings. The conclusion summarizes and evaluates the results of the investigation. And then the bibliography documents everything. So we have our way of doing title pages and outlines, so we'll skip all this, but here's some principles for the introduction. It's a reader's guide to the paper. It tells the reader what the problem was, what problem was studied and solved, how you went about finding the answers, and perhaps even suggest a solution to the problem. I'm okay with, in the introduction, to go ahead and state your conclusion. If you state it in the introduction and you state it in the conclusion, then it's clear where you stand. It's clear to the reader where you stand. In the main body, that's the presentation of the findings. It's the longest part of the paper, and it's divided into sections and subsections. And then summary and conclusions, summarizes the findings, draws conclusions. Do not put new evidence in a conclusion. I see that more than I care to admit, where I'm reading the conclusion and there's something totally new in there that hasn't been presented before. Never do that. If it's new, it's got to be up in the body, not in the summary and conclusion. Make it brief. You don't want a lengthy summary and conclusion. Just summarize the presentation of the data and make a conclusion that comes from that summary. Conclusions presented may be firm or tentative, and I'm fine with that as long as you're concluding something. Sometimes the research only suggests a solution to a problem. At times the research may turn up areas that need to be investigated and could be a topic for further study. It is proper to note such instances in the conclusions. So you can conclude something like this. You can say, tentatively, this is what we conclude. That's fine. You're stating a conclusion, but you are being honest and saying, you know, the data is not 100%. And so this is where we are right now. And also that is telling the reader that there's room to expand this research. There's room for further study. That is the end of video 4.3.